All right, hello everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about my workflow for dealing with retrofit. Now, this is not going to be an in-depth tutorial about retrofit. Actually, this tutorial already assumes that you know what retrofit is and you have retrofit up and running. This is just going to be a broad overview of how I would go about hitting a new API endpoint. Recently, I'm building a Twitch application. And so since I'm dealing with their API, I've had to use Retrofit a lot, and I've sort of developed my own little workflow to go about it, and I thought I'd share it with everyone. Right, so I usually break this down into 4 steps. The first step being we use Postman to query the endpoint. We then model the response object. We then create a method in the Retrofit interface, and then we create a method in our repository layer. Right, so first things first, we go to this first one here. We use Postman to query the endpoint. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Postman, it's essentially, well, it's got a lot of tools it allows you to do, but the main one I use it is just hitting endpoints and getting the response object back. Now, as you can see here, we're actually using this streams, let me just scroll up here, this get followed streams. So you can see here, we get access, it tells us here, essentially the endpoint we're hitting. It says here it's a get request, and then you see it's a query parameter here of user ID, and then it says we need a header of authorization and then a header of client ID, and then it gives us an example response back. Now we could use this here to model our response object, but I like to use Postman here just to give myself another level of confidence. So as you can see here, we're hitting that endpoint with the proper user ID. I've also given it the proper headers, and essentially it gives us back this response object. Now, using Postman really has 2 main benefits. The first one being that it verifies to us that we are hitting the proper endpoint. We've provided all the proper parameters, all the proper headers, and everything else. And the second major benefit being that it verifies to us that the response object is in JSON, because JSON is what Retrofit uses to convert into our Kotlin object. Without JSON, you're usually going to get some sort of error that says malformed JSON, when really it means there's just no JSON available. Right, so now that we've used Postman, and we've hit the proper endpoint, we can move on to the second step, which is model the response object. Now, as you can see here, we have data and a bunch of things. But if we actually go to our class, you can see our response object that we're modeling. We have a data class called follow live streams, and then we have a value of data, and then it's a list of the stream data. And then you can see with this stream data, that looks a lot more like what we're seeing from Postman here. So you might be wondering, why have we split this up into two different objects? And it's mainly because the way that the JSON is structured, right? When we look to model a JSON response object, when we look to model that into a Kotlin data class, we really need to be wary of 2 main things. The first one being these brackets. So as you can see, we have a square bracket here and a curly bracket. Now, a square bracket here in JSON represents a list. You can see here in this tag section here, we have tags, and then we have square bracket, and then we have all these strings. Now for us, that means it's going to be a tags value, and the tags is going to be full of a list of strings. And we can actually look like that we have it modeled here. We actually have tags down here, and we can see it's a list of strings, right? So why do we have this object, and then we have data, and then a list, and then another object? We have that specifically because of these query and these, because of these curly and these square brackets. As you can see here, we have a curly brackets. Curly brackets, again, represent an object. So we know we need to create an object, right? So we've done that. We've created the object, the data class, right, with this followed live streams data. We then go inside the object, and we see there needs to be a data variable. Okay, so we go back here, we've created that data variable. We then go and we see that there's a square bracket, so we know there needs to be a list. We've defined a list. We then see that there's another curly bracket, which means there's going to be this entire object. And then so we can see we've created that entire object. And then we go inside that object, and then we create all the variables necessary. So that's really what you need to look out for when you decide to map any sort of JSON to a Kotlin class. You really want to be on the lookout for the square brackets and the curly brackets. Those are probably going to be the hardest things when you if you're not using some sort of tool to map it. Right, so then we can move on to step 3, where we want to create the method inside the retrofit interface. Now, retrofit, what it really allows us to do, it allows us to take an interface and essentially model what we want the HTTP response to be, right? So as you can see here, if you're familiar with retrofit, right, we're defining the base URL elsewhere. Then we can see here we've actually defined a get class, or a get request, and it's actually going to be the streams.followed. And then you can see here through this header parameter and through this query parameter, what it allows us to do, as you see, is authorization header and this client ID header. It allows us to define dynamic values. So essentially on each method call, we can create unique authorization, client ID, and user ID values. Then you can see here, I want to draw your attention to this response real quick. Notice that this response is from Retrofit here, because we've actually made our own response object that I'll talk about when we get into the next step. But just know that here, this response is from Retrofit. Then we see here we have the response, and it's going to be our followed live streams object. And essentially what Retrofit is going to do, it's going to get that JSON object back. It's going to give us, it's going to map that into a response object, and then into the followed live streams object, and then of course into our stream data. So now that we've essentially made the method that's going to make the actual request, we can move into step 4, which is create the method in the repository layer. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the repository layer, also usually called the data layer, it's usually the layer that's talking to the API, that's doing the actual talking. So here I have this implementation. Without getting too much into the nitty gritty here, like as you can see, I've used override because I'm implementing an interface. If you want to look at the code, I'll leave a link down in the description below to my GitHub. But essentially, you can see here that I have this authorization token, client ID, user ID. Then you can see here I'm returning a flow. Now the reason I'm returning a flow is essentially so classes that are downstream of this flow, which will actually be my view models, the view models will be able to call this method and then call collect. And then collect, right, being a suspending function, they'll be able to get to respond accordingly to the response objects. Now these response objects, right, I pointed out, these are actually different response objects. As you can see, we have response.loading, and then we have response.success and response.failure. Now these is actually a response object that I've created myself to essentially model the 3 possible states of the network's responses, right? We have loading, we have success, and then we have failure. So just know here that this is a different response object than the one that we're talking about here. These are 2 different response objects, right? So then we simply get the response, right? We call get followed streams, and we provide it with this authorization token, the client ID, and the user ID. Then we can go ahead and we can do a conditional which says if response is successful, right? If it's successful, I'm just simply doing logging here for my sanity, and then we admit the response. We say it's going to be a success, and we give it the response.body. Now the body is actually going to be our live streams data here, or our followed live streams data. Then we can say else if it's not. So if it's not successful, that means some sort of HTTP error has happened, right? It's going to send us back. We're going to actually emit a failure, which is going to see an error code, and then it's going to give us the response code. If we actually go ahead and look at the documentation, on this get follow stream, if we scroll down to the bottom, we get the possible response codes, which 200 representing a successful response, then 400 being a bad request, and then 401 being an unauthorized. So that's what's going to happen there if it is not successful. Right, so just to recap real quick, first thing we do is we use Postman to get the actual JSON object. We then use that to model a new response object inside of Kotlin. We then create the method in the Retrofit interface, and then we create a method in the repository layer that is actually going to make the call to the API. Right. So with that, it was a nice short one today, but I thought I'd give everyone my little quick process so you can go about using Retrofit a little more systematically. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.